Hey everyone, in this video we're gonna dive into Substance and we're gonna create textures for this cone attack. So we're not gonna create the spark textures because I think we've done them some time ago, but we're gonna try to recreate one-to-one those noise textures that you can see that are actually panning across this mesh that we did in Houdini in the previous video. I think we're gonna come up with three different textures. Initially, I wanted to split those into different videos. However, because those are easy setups, I think we're just going to combine those three textures into one video. Alright, so I hope you're going to enjoy this one, and let's dive into Substance Designer now. So I'm going to start with the first noise texture. I'm going to bring shape node. I'm going to scale it down just a little bit to maybe 0.9. Next, I'm going to use trapezoid, transform grayscale, take the top stretch to 1 and disable the tiling mode. You might even increase the size actually to 0.97 on your shape. I'm going to use transformation 2D next. I'm going to scale it down. You scale it down by clicking and holding Alt and Shift. And with your mouse button, you just drag it down. Okay. Okay, so this is gonna be a mask for our tile sampler. So I'm gonna bring tile sampler. I'm gonna hold Alt and click with my mouse to detach it. I'm gonna plug this into the mask map input. In here, I'm going to change the pattern to disk, change the amount to 8x8, scroll down where the mask is here, mask map threshold, set it to 1 and invert it. Scroll up, there's position as well. I'm going to randomize it by taking it to maybe somewhere around 0.7. A little bit higher to scale, so I'm just going to put the X scale to 0.6. Randomize X and Y, bring the scale up and tweak the scale random as well. I'm gonna use blend next, and in blend I'm just gonna use subtract. And as you can see, we're kind of getting this those shapes, and we're getting those circles to cut into our triangle. Now I'm just gonna scale down where the position is, so I can actually get something a bit more suitable that I want. I think at this stage it's not that much important what kind of shape. What I'm looking is just something pointy, something like this. Next, I'm just gonna use this for another tile sampler, and I'm gonna plug this into the pattern input 1. So I'm going to use this pattern input here. For the amount, I'm just going to go for something low, maybe 6x6. Scale down where the position is, randomize it, scale it up. I'm going to use the scale random as well. And scale random on each of the axes. And we're getting a map like this. What I'm gonna do next, I'm just gonna use a directional blur. In here, I'm just gonna change the degrees to 90. Oops, not 900, 90. And scale it just a bit like this with the intensity. And maybe let's go with 20. Next, I'm gonna use a directional warp. And for the intensity input, I'm just going to use gradient. I'm going to go for gradient 1. Okay, for the degrees, I'm going to try 90. And for intensity, let's try something higher. Maybe 50. Okay, I'm just gonna blur this just a little bit with 0.5. I want to see if it's actually tileable, so I'm gonna use transformation node, divide by 2, and as you can see it's not tileable. And I think it's because I actually added gradient to the warp, so let's add parallel noise instead. Oops. With the low scale. And we're getting a little bit of distortion on our shapes. I'm gonna blur it a little bit. Now it's tileable, so I'm just gonna use slope, blur grayscale, and for the slope I'm actually gonna use gradient here. Gradient linear 1. I'm gonna max the samples. For the intensity, maybe 50, but I'm gonna change the mode to min. As you can see, we're kind of getting some of the artifacts here, and those are because of the slope, so we need to blur it a little bit to get rid of those. So I'm gonna ramp it up to 1, use this transformation to see if it's tileable and if we're getting any artifacts. And it seems like we're getting just a little bit, so maybe increase the blur to 2 and they should be gone. You might still get a little bit, but I don't think this would be an issue later on in the engine. Right, so we get this. Now maybe we want to get a lot more intensity on some of the shapes. So what I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna bring a histogram scan, run the position somewhere around here with the high contrast, because I only want the highlights like those, for example, and I'm gonna blend those together. And this one actually goes to the top because I want to control the opacity of it. That one goes to the background. I'm gonna set it to add with the ability to control the intensity. Okay, I think those shapes are a little bit too hard edged, so what I'm gonna bring blur and add those with blur. I'm gonna set blur to 5 for now. So now maybe let's try to run this through a gradient map. I'm gonna add a blue color. I'm gonna change the this to smooth as well, ramp it up, smoothness to 1, and here I'm just gonna put a blue color, and in between will be very light blue color. And now we can go back maybe to our tile sampler and try to get a little bit more interesting map, because I think this gap here is a bit too big. So I'm gonna go to position random and just tweak that value. Okay, maybe something like this. If you want a slightly larger shapes, you can experiment with those shapes that we generated. I'm just gonna stick to something like this because I want this noise map to be fairly soft. For the directional blur, I think I'm just gonna increase it to fill the space a bit more. For the warp, it depends what you want really. I mean, this one looks really nice, so that's no warp, and this one might work as well. So I think I'm just gonna export something like this and something like this as well, because if you look at this map, if you add additional distortion in the engine, it might look a bit more like a smoky texture in the engine. Okay, so that's our first texture. I'm just gonna run this through gradient, black and white, and I'm gonna plug this to alpha and merge. Okay, so the color map you can put into RGB, and this one you can plug into the alpha. You can export it like this, or if you want to just have black and white, you can plug this here, no alpha, and you can save that texture using this button here. I think I really like our previous texture as well, so I'll export this one and that one with a zero intensity on directional warp. Right, okay, so we've got this. Now maybe let's create something a bit more different. Let's create a wave. So I'm gonna bring parallel noise. Let me go back to the engine. So as you can see, this at the end, the smoky bits, smoky texture, that our texture that we've created right now. And now we're just gonna focus on this wave that is traveling across the cone. So I'm gonna start with parallel noise. I'm gonna scale it down and use the cross section. Okay, in the cross section, I kind of want like a fairly smooth line. So I think I'm just going to reduce the scale even more on the parallel noise. So I want this to be a little bit wavy, but not too much. Right, I'm gonna go with this. I'm gonna change this to gradient. I'm gonna run it through histogram scan. And I just want this highlight at the top, like this. And I'm gonna blur it within low intensity, maybe 2. And I'm gonna bring those two together using blend. However, that one goes to the top because I want to control the opacity. Change it to add. So now I've got this texture. I want to find a way maybe to blend it a little bit better. Okay, so I'm gonna run it through blur, and just to see with the intensity, just for this to blend a little bit nicer. So I think that will do. Next, I want to move this a little bit to the top, not to waste the texture space. And now if I can just move it left to right, you can see it's styling very nicely. I'm gonna actually take this one and run it through a directional warp. I'm gonna bring parallel noise with the low scale, maybe 5. Let's try maybe 6. I'm gonna ramp up the intensity and the degrees as well to maybe 90. Intensity, let's try 50, 80, maybe 100, or maybe less. With 100 I just don't like this circle here, so I'm just gonna, you can either go to parallel noise and play with the disorder, and I think that's actually what I'm gonna do, and maybe reduce the intensity just a little bit to get something a bit more wispy. Okay, I just don't like this bit here. Something like that. Now I'm gonna blend those two together. Let's use maybe max. Nope. Min. Nope. I think max might work, but we need to control the opacity, so I'm just gonna switch those around. And I'm gonna bring the transform node just before I'm gonna plug this into the blend. So I can actually double click on my blend, click once on transformation 2D, and using shift, holding shift and my mouse button, I'm just gonna drag it down a little bit to fill the space a bit better. And now I'm just gonna reduce the opacity on that one to blend those two together. I'm gonna run it through another blur, grayscale, to create a bit more smoother transition between those two. And as a last bit, what you might want to do, just want to run it through warp with parallel noise to get a little bit more distortion. I'm gonna scale it down a bit, and in here we don't need the full weight of the warp, so maybe 0.5 might work for us. And now is the tricky part, because it depends what you want. You might export a couple of those waves. So the first one might be this one. Another one might be with a little more blurry shape like this, and another one will be a bit more contrasty. However, I prefer only those two because you can control the contrast inside of the engine. And I'm gonna do the same thing. So actually I'm gonna bring merge, so RGB merge. And what you can do, you can basically put this one to red channel, this one to green, and this one to blue, and export it like this. And in the game engine you can use one of those channels to see which one works best. Okay, and the last noise map I want to do, I'm actually going to use cells 1, and this will be something similar to our first map but with a different approach a little bit. Hopefully that's going to give us a little bit different results. So cells, I'm going to invert it, and I'm going to scale it down a little bit as well. Right, so now I just want to extract some of the highlights because I want to apply them later on. So I'm just going to use histogram scan for this, change the position and the contrast as well. As you can see, we're kind of getting those highlights there. I'm just going to select the cells and change this order just a little bit to get the different shapes in different locations. And I'm going to increase the contrast here to get those shapes. I don't want them to join together, so at the point when they start joining, I'm just gonna stop. I'm gonna use blend and blend those together now. I'm not gonna blur them prior to this because I actually want to use this with directional blur next, so that's gonna take care of the sharpness of it. So I'm gonna set the degrees to be 90. And maybe let's try 50, maybe 30. I think I'm gonna increase the scale on the cells maybe to something like 9. Change the disorder as well, because I want a fairly soft texture. Okay, so I'm gonna run with something like this, and that will be our first texture. Next, I'm gonna bring a blend and this map, rotate it, kind of low amount on Y. I'm gonna blur this one as well, maybe with 3. Put it together and set it to multiply. So we get this one, which is quite intense, and you got a lot more grayscale there. This one maybe a bit more sharper lines. I'm not sure which one's gonna work yet, but I usually export a couple of the textures, see which one works, and use one of those. You might want to run this one through auto levels just to level out the grayscale. Same with this one, just before you export it, run it through auto levels as well. And maybe let's try to do the last texture. Rotate it and get rid of the smoothness as well. And let's start introducing a bit more amount on the X as well. Right, I'm gonna blur this with the value of let's say 4. I'm gonna use directional warp next with some Perlin noise, however fairly low scale, and I actually want to add 90 degree and quite high intensity. Let's try maybe 100. I think 100 might be a little bit too much, so let's maybe go with 50. Okay, we're gonna do the same thing. So we're gonna take our original texture, blend it with this, and we're gonna set it to multiply. And what I like about this texture, we're kind of getting those lines every now and then. So if we run this through auto levels, you can see it's a fairly irregular texture with some lines there as well. If you want more lines, just increase the Perlin noise, but I would stick to something fairly low, maybe 10 on the scale on that Perlin noise. And you can do the same thing. So you can bring a merge, RGB merge, and do the same thing. So export 3 textures, one into different channels, and then use one of those channels to see which one works best. Another thing, if you want a bit more highlights, what you can do, you can get this, run it through histogram scan, high contrast, and blend it together with that texture, set it to add. You might want to blend it, blur it a little bit before you plug this in. And you get a little bit more highlights there. And then you can control it with either with opacity, with blur as well if you want this to be a bit more sharper, and with histogram scan itself if you want less of those. So I think this one might be really cool for the distortion and for the smoky part of the of your effect. Okay, so we've got a lot of textures. We've got probably 1 out of this one, 3 for the wave, and for the additional distortion or smoky effect, 3 of those. To be honest, once you decide which one you like the most, what you could do, you can actually combine those 1, 2, 3 into one. So for example, you like this one, so that one goes to the red channel. You like one of those, and that one goes to the blue channel, and one of those goes to the green channel. And then you have one texture with 3 different maps for your effect. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you're gonna create some of the effects using these techniques. So there was not much to do in this part, and there's nothing specific, but I hope you learn a little bit about the noise texture and how to generate something different than Voronoi or Perlin texture. Because I think later on, once you start creating your own effects, the noise maps and those tileable maps are quite important, and it's always better to run with something else than a default map. Alright, thank you so much.